Hello, advanced social psychology students. This is the video lecture that covers Unit 2, Module 8, Chapter 6, Influence and Conforming. So let me call up the PowerPoint slides. Here we go. This to me is one of the most fun chapters in the entire book. Actually, working in groups is my absolute favorite decision making, but this one is a close second. It just changes how, after you learn this stuff, it's just going to change the way you look at people and you try to explain their behavior because it's just so different than how you think it is. Or at least that was my takeaway when I was learning all of this stuff. So what do we mean by social influence? Let's talk about the definition. So social influence is the influence of other people on our everyday thoughts, feelings, and behavior. And because in the United States, we live in such an individualistic culture, we like to think that other people don't have that much of an influence on our thoughts, feelings, and behavior. We like to see ourselves as pretty independent from other people. We can pull ourselves up from the bootstraps and such like this. However, the research is clear that we are much more influenced by the people around us than we might think we are. And so in this chapter, we're going to talk, or the textbook talks about conformity, which is how you're likely to end up conforming or behaving the way the people around you are behaving, even when you're not asked to do so or told to do so or anything like that. Then they're going to talk about obedience. And this is when people in authority are asking you to do something or telling you to do something. And what's the likelihood of you obeying them and doing what they say? And then we're going to talk about Zimbardo's prison study. Actually, we're not going to talk about it. I have a video that I'd like you to watch about it, but it's a prison study where it looks at the roles that people are given and how that role ends up affecting your behavior to much larger extent than you might think. And we're going to end the chapter talking about leadership. And that is how our leaders, again, it's sort of like the authority, how our leaders end up influencing us. So this is influence and conforming. And what's underneath all of, another thing we're going to talk about is minority influence. When people who have a minority idea, how do they end up persuading us that they're right? And we know that the minority is powerful, or the society would never change. The majority of people would do it a certain way, and it would more and more people would go to the majority, and that's what then everyone would be doing. But that's not what happens in the world. Things swing back and forth. So we know that people with minority ideas tend to influence the majority and bring the majority to their way. And now that's the majority idea. And then it swings back as now the minority brings them back, and so on and so on. So one thing that you need to understand that's underlying all of social influence is that there's two very different reasons for social influence. There's two very different reasons of why we let the behaviors and the thoughts and opinions of the people around us affect our own thoughts, opinions, feelings, and behavior. And one of it we call informational social influence. And informational social influence is when you believe what you conform to other people, you obey other people, you're doing what they tell you to do or what they ask you to do, or what that you just copy them and do what they're doing because you believe they have more information or better information than you have. So when I go and see my doctor, my medical doctor, and he tells me, Mary, I'd like you to do blah, blah, blah. I obey him because he's an authority person, but I obey him based on informational social influence. I think that he's reading the medical journals. He went through, 6 or 8 years of medical study. He's had 20 years of experience working with different people. I believe that he knows more about aspects of my health than I know about. So when he tells me, I think you have an infection right now and I need you to take this antibiotic to get rid of your walking pneumonia, I take the pill due to informational social influence. I believe he knows more about how to cure pneumonia than I do. And so I'm following what he says. I'm obeying him because I believe he has more information than I do. However, Some of the time when we allow others to influence us and we're influenced by others, it's not because we think they know more than we do. We call this normative social influence. And normative social influence is when we like go along to get along. We just do what everyone else is doing because we know that that will allow us to fit in and belong more to the group. I know when I was in middle school, I came home and I was kind of looking around at the beginning, and I came home and I remember saying to my mom, all the popular girls seem to be wearing these pants and they say love, love, love all over them with a pink belt. So can we go to the store and buy these pants that say love, love, love all over them and have a pink belt? Did I like the love, love, love pants with a pink belt? Not particularly. Did I think the people who wore them knew more about what was the right thing to wear? No. I didn't think that they had better style or knew more about what was comfortable or anything like that. I just saw that the popular girls were wearing that, and I thought if I wore that too, I'd have a shot of getting along better with the popular girls and I'd become more popular, and I wanted to be more popular. That's the normative social influence. You're doing it because everyone else is doing it, not because you think they know more, but because you think or you know that similarity leads to attraction and you want people to like you. You want to belong to the group and you just want to go along to get along. Okay. All right. I now want to talk about conformity. And to talk about conformity, I need to talk about two very classic studies of conformity. One is by Sheriff and one is by Ash. And I have a short video clip that you can see that highlights some of Ash's work, although I'm going to be talking about a more classic, one of his more classic studies. He then did lots of different versions of it. And so I think the video that they have, there's a slight different version of it, but you still get a sense of what they're doing. Okay, Sheriff, you need to be really careful if you go to YouTube and look at videos of Sheriff, because Sheriff did a lot of work looking at how groups change as new people come in. And I'm afraid you're going to find that work of his rather than his classic, excuse me, I have the hiccups, his classic study of conformity. So your textbook does a great job talking about his classic study of conformity. And I'm going to just cover it also right now so that you get an idea in case you like to not only read something, but also hear someone talk about it. So Sheriff's study, he was interested in conformity when there's no true correct answer. His idea perhaps was that if people conform when there's no true correct answer, then people will be more similar. And we know that similarity leads to attraction. And so really having groups conform to one another when there's no true correct answer would lead for the group to, the group members to get along better and like each other more and enjoy their time together. And it could have all kinds of positive implications. So he was looking when there's no true correct answer, how easy or difficult is it to get group members to conform to one another? So he ended up using this phenomenon that exists that's called the autokinetic effect. He's not trying to study the autokinetic effect. He's studying conformity, but he uses the autokinetic effect in order to study conformity. And what the autokinetic effect is that if you sit in a pitch black, dark room and you stare at a pinpoint of light that's not moving at all, the light will appear to move. It just has to do with the way the cones and the rods work in our eyes. The light will appear to move even though it's not moving. Now, there are huge individual differences in how far that point of light will appear to move. So some people may think it moves very small amount, others will think it moves much further. But in reality, the light is not moving at all. So you can see how this is an ambiguous task. The true correct answer when asked, how far did the light move, is it didn't. 0 centimeters or millimeters or inches. 0, it didn't move at all. But no one will say 0 because to our eyes, it looks as though it's moving. So Sheriff was like, this is a great ambiguous task that I can use to study conformity. And what he did is he had people arrive the first day to a laboratory alone. And when they arrived, he said, great, I'm going to sit you in this pitch black, dark room. I'm going to show a pinpoint of light on the wall, and I want you to tell me how far the dot of light appears to move. And people gave their estimates. And he said, thank you very much. Tomorrow, I'd like you to come back again. So the people came back again. This time, however, on day 2, rather than being alone, he'd have 3 or 4 people in the same room. And he'd tell them, once again, I'm going to ask you, how far do you think this dot of light is moving? However, he told them, I don't want you to discuss this. And he never says anything about, you guys are like a jury, you all have to reach consensus. He says nothing about reaching consensus. The only instructions that they're given is that you're not allowed to talk about it with one another. Each of you is just to state out loud how far you think that dot of light has moved. On day 3, they come back again, and again, they're in a group, stating again out loud how far the dot of light has moved, again, without talking with one another or ever being told that they have to reach consensus. And then day 4, again, they're in a group. So day 1, they're alone. Day 2, 3, and 4, they're in a group stating their estimates out loud. And what Sheriff found was that on day 1, the estimates varied greatly. On day 2, when they're in a group, the estimates became a little bit more similar. Day 3, even more similar. And by day 4, nearly every group, the members had converged to the same estimate. And one thing that I find interesting is in his classic study, that estimate seemed to be the average of the first day's estimates. So it wasn't as though one person played a leadership role and everyone started saying what they said. It's almost like they just all averaged it together. It wasn't true of every single group, but that's what the groups tended to do. It's almost as if day 1, you state what you think the answer is. Day 2, you state your answer, but you then get to listen that other people's answers are either much greater or much less than yours. So when you go back the 3rd day, you've either inflated or deflated your estimate based on what you heard the other participants do. And then you get more feedback of what they think. And so by day 4, everyone's basically giving the same estimate. That's Sheriff's classic study of conformity. And his conclusion was, it is very easy to demonstrate conformity with ambiguous tasks. In other words, when there's no true correct answer, people in a group will very easily conform to one another. And it's very easy to develop. I mean, he developed it in groups of 3 or 4 people in only 4 days, 3 days of being together, without ever being told that they had to reach consensus or that there's any advantage to reaching consensus or anything like that. They just did it on their own. Then Ash comes along, and Ash says, that's kind of interesting, Sheriff, that you found it with an ambiguous task. That actually could help our culture because, like, when there's no true correct answer, if you want to feel like you're part of a group, we could all do the same thing, conform to one another, and now we like one another more and we feel more groupy. Does that make sense? I always think of, you go to a movie at a movie theater on a Friday night, and it looks as though like a group of middle school girls will walk in to watch a particular movie, and they all seem to have on the same outfit, different versions of the same outfit, the same type shirt, just in different colors, the same kind of pants, different colors. They all seem to be wearing the same perfume because it's just a waft. That's all you smell. Their hairstyles are all real similar. And they're, seem to be having a great time together. Did those girls all get together and say, when we go to the movie tonight, let's all wear our such and such tops and our such and such pants and our such and such shoes and all wear the same perfume? No. They just all conform to one another in this thing where there is no correct answer, like what you're supposed to wear, other than there's no correct answer. So the conformity can help the group members become more groupy and like one another and help, it's all very positive. But Ash wanted to show when there is a true correct answer, people are not going to conform. It's with an unambiguous task, we would get no conforming. So there's a 5-minute video that I'd like you to watch right now that says Ash's Classic Study. I'm going to give you a moment to stop this video so you can watch that video. It gives you a clip of one of the videos from actual subjects in the study. And I just kind of want to have you get that overview of it before I give you some details. Okay? All right, welcome back. Thank you for going to look at that Ash's study. So in the version that I'm going to tell you about Ash's study is slightly different than the one in that video, but it's enough similar where we'll give you, that video will help you sort of get a sense of what it was like. So in Ash's Classic Study of Conformity, the real subject actually went last. And the people were sitting around like an L-shaped, or I'm sorry, a U-shaped table with the experimenter up front with one card that had the 3 lines of various lengths. In some videos, it says ABC. The one you saw, it says 1, 2, 3. Then there's another card with just one line. And the participants are told that they're supposed to pick which of these lines matches this line. And as you can see in the video, it was very clear what the correct answer was. It was an unambiguous task. It was very clear what the correct answer was. So what happened is if you were a subject in the study, you would walk in and 5 of the desks would already have, or 5 of the chairs around the U-shaped desk would already have people sitting in them. So you'd sit in the 6th seat in the last spot. And the experimenter would explain what you're going to do. And he would tell you, much like in Sheriff's study, I don't want you to discuss your answers at all. All you're supposed to do is state which line best matches the line on the other card. Again, just like in Sheriff's study, they're never told anything about how you have to agree with one another, you have to reach consensus, nothing like that. Okay? So the first few trials are just regular ordinary trials where all the first 5 people all say the correct answer. And now it's your turn to go and you say the true correct answer. But then there are certain trials that we call, that Ash called key trials. And on the key trials, the first 5 people in the room, you think they're subjects, but they're not. They're really confederates in on the experiment with the experimenter. And on certain key trials, they have been trained to all say the same wrong answer. Okay? So when the answer is clearly 2, for example, they're each going to say 1. So the key trial begins, this person says 1, this person says 1, this person says 1, this person says 1, this person says 1. It's now your turn. What do you say? Do you say what you know to be the true correct answer, which is 3, or do you conform and say 1? And what Ash found in his classic study is about a third of the people, about 33% of the people, will conform on any one of those key trials. But if you analyze the data slightly differently and you ask in the study, because like in one of the studies, there were about 200 trials and only 20 of them were key trials. So you could analyze the data saying, did this particular participant ever conform on any of the key trials? And if they conformed on even one key trial, then they go in the yes, they conformed category. And in order to be in the no, they never conformed, then in all 20 of those key trials, they had to give the true correct answer. They never conformed even once. And when he analyzed the data that way, depending upon which study you're talking about, between 75 and close to 80% of the people conformed at least once. So Ash was able to find conformity even with an unambiguous task. And that is really disturbing to us. This means even when there is a true correct answer, people will go along to get along. And this could lead us to making all kinds of group mistakes and errors because people aren't doing what they know to be true and correct, what they know is true and correct. They're saying things that they don't even believe themselves just in order to get along with the group. Does that kind of make sense? And that's kind of scary to think this is done in the United States. Do you know what I mean? This is in a culture that values individualism, that values people who stand alone. And yet it's very easy. Between 75 and 80% of the people conformed at least once on a task that means nothing to us. Who cares? You're never going to work with these people again. You didn't even know them. You never were told you had to agree with them. And it's lines. Who cares? Like, what does this mean in other areas where if you don't conform with the people, they may exclude you from the group? Like, oh, this is kind of scary. Ash did a whole bunch of studies that allowed him to change some of the variables to see what factors end up affecting conformity. And so one factor that he looked at was group size. And he found that with a group of 2, there's no conformity. So if you have one Confederate and the real subjects never conform. When you get a group of 3, you get a little bit more conformity. 4, a little bit more conformity. 5, a little bit more conformity. 6, a little bit more conformity. 7, around 6, 7, or 8, the conformity starts to level off. It doesn't go down. It's just whether you have 6, 7, 10, or 20 people, you're not getting more conformity by adding more people. Does that make sense? So it increases from 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 or 7, and then it increases to 3, 4, 5, and then it levels off. It doesn't go down, but it levels off. Group cohesiveness plays a role. The more groupy the group is, the more conformity there will be. So in Ash's classic study, the students didn't know one another. However, in later versions, he'd have groups that they were told they all belong to the same sorority, or they all belong to the same fraternity, or they all, they were told that they have something in common. And for a group that was more cohesive, like belonging to the sorority, it's a very, groupy group, then they were much more likely to conform than it was when it was with a group of strangers. Another thing that he looked at was the status of the other group members. So just ask yourself for a minute, do you think you're more likely to conform to a higher status person or a lower status person? You probably guessed correctly. In Ash's study, variants of his classic study, he found people are more likely to conform to a higher status person. Now, that might be because we think that that higher status person is higher, has more information than we do. Then it would be informational influence rather than normative influence. So that might be why. But sometimes, like in Ash's study, when we're looking at lines, why would someone who seems to have more money and therefore seems to have higher status than you, why would you think they'd see the lines better? Probably not. It's probably still that normative social influence. Gender becomes a tricky one. And I really like how the end of your chapter, they do a whole section on gender where you can really look at gender and conformity. Gender is tricky. When we are in the laboratory where you can control all the different confounding variables, we tend to find no difference in conformity between men and women. However, when you go into the real world and you do studies of conformity, it seems as though women will conform more. So at least one researcher, Eagly, has hypothesized that maybe that's because lower status people conform to higher status people, and women oftentimes have lower status than men. And so she did some research where when you gave people, you told them about, John and Mary or whatever, and you said, John is doing this, what will Mary do? People will assume that Mary conforms. However, if you give them the exact same scenario, but you make it clear as you're giving them the scenario, John is doing da da da. Mary, who is John's supervisor, what do you think she'll do? No one then thinks that Mary will conform to John. So there's some research that suggests that is consistent with Eagly's hypothesis that women conform more in the real world because they tend to have a lower status position. And really the gender difference is really a status difference, not a true gender difference. Type of response. So this one, I think this was in the end of the video that I had you watch. Type of response is really interesting. Remember that you gave your answer out loud if you were the real subject, and you were always the last one to go. In another version of the study, once the majority of people, I guess it would be the fourth person out of the six. Once the fourth of the six person said the same wrong answer, the researcher would say, well, since four of you have already voted the same, then majority rules. So it doesn't really matter what the last two of you say. But please write down your answer just so we know for future. But really, we're going to say that this group says the correct answer is two, because the majority of you say it's two, because these four people have said two and there's only two left. Does that make sense? And when they do the study like that, conformity goes down to almost zero. So basically, people, when the type of response is public and out loud, they conform. But when it's private, they're writing it down, they don't conform at all. This lets us know that even though they're saying two, they really believe the correct answer is three. They're saying two to get along and go along. It's normative social influence. You haven't really changed their mind. It's not like they're agreeing with everyone because they think those people are right. When they privately write down their answer, they put down the correct answer, not the conforming answer. And then the last thing that I think is very interesting, especially given prior week's research where we talked about cognitive dissonance theory and how important it is to us to be consistent. Ash did a variation of the study where he went in the opposite order. So you, as the true subject, would give your answer first. So let's say you gave the right answer of one. Then all the Confederates go, and they all give the same wrong answer. 3, 3, 3, 3, 3. The experimenter then says to you, everyone else has said 3. Do you want to stick to your answer of 1 or change your answer? And surprising, at least it surprises me, people do not change their answer. Being consistent is more powerful than our desire to conform. Does that make sense? So conformity, it's really easy to make it happen and it's strong, but our desire to be consistent is even more strong. So that's kind of interesting, I think. So conformity, let's step back a minute. So we've talked about some factors that affect conformity. We've talked about two very classic studies of conformity, where if you have an MSBS, Master's of Science in Behavioral Sciences with a general psychology track, everyone is going to expect you to know Ash's classic study of conformity and Sheriff's classic study of conformity. These are very huge, big things. Even if you've had a psychology class, they're going to expect you to know them, much less a graduate level course in social psychology. So these are really important studies to know about. I hope you can see that with the conformity studies, what we could really rename it and call it majority influence. It's when the majority of the people influence the minority. So in Ash's classic study, you've got 5 Confederates and then the actual real subject, the 6th person. So this is the majority of people, and then if you're the real subject in the study, you're the minority person. And the majority actually influence the minority. However, minorities have influence also. And when I'm saying minority here, I don't mean a racial minority or something like that. I mean someone who has the minority point of view. So you're in Ash's study, you're the one who gave a different response than everyone else. We know that the minorities in our cultures must have influence. Otherwise, our cultures would not change, right? So I'm going to use an example. When I was growing up, now remember, this is in the 1960s and 1970s in the Boston area. None of the moms in the neighborhoods worked outside the home, because if you worked outside the home, it was like saying that your husband could not take care of you financially. And so it was like a slap on your husband's face saying that he cannot provide for you properly. So even if you didn't have hardly any money at all and you were scrimping by, you scrimped by, the women did not work. That was the majority position. Now, in the neighborhood I grew up in, there was one woman who worked as a teacher, Mrs. Clark. And she was married to a professor. So people are like, well, see, she has to work because professors don't get paid very much money. And so like the other husbands tend to be doctors and lawyers and engineers. And my dad was a technical writer. They made more money. So it was like everyone sort of felt sorry for poor Mrs. Clark, who had to work because the husband couldn't make enough money teaching at a university. But she had the minority position. But as you know, as time went on, women who had this minority position started to get louder and louder voices. And I remember when I would see Mrs. Clark, she always seemed to be having a good time. And when she was at the afternoon coffees, because like she had the day off because it was a school holiday or something, she seemed to have the most interesting stories. And to me, a much more exciting life than the life that my mom had raising the six of us. At this time, there were probably only four or five of us. And some of the other moms seemed really bored sometimes too, but Mrs. Clark never seemed bored. So over time, clearly, the women who were working outside the home that used to be the minority started to convince the majority that their way of life actually had some real advantages. And then we had the women's movement, the feminist second wave or whatever, and more women started to work outside the home. More and more mothers were working outside the home, to the point now where that's the majority stance. So I have two sisters. I keep telling you how I'm the oldest of six kids. I have two sisters who decided not to work outside the home. One is married to a military man, and so she raises the four kids. He goes off sometimes for a whole year. He was in Iraq for almost a year and then went back for a second tour. She doesn't work outside the home. She raises the kids while the husband works. And I've got another sister also who works from home, not working from home. She works to raise her kids at home, but she doesn't have a job outside of raising a kid. And they're now the minority. And like I always worked when I was raising kids, and I just retired, but I worked most of my life. So I was in the majority of a working mom. And it's really interesting. My sisters say when they go to a party, people go like, "What do you do all day?" When that used to be the norm. What happened to convince the majority of people that the minority, like Mrs. Clark, was correct to such an extent that that's now the majority? And you've got my two sisters over here, but I keep seeing on the internet like this traditional wife thing, like that might come back or whatever. And so now maybe the minority here is starting to influence some of the majority to go back that way. That kind of makes sense. Personally, I always thought it's good for someone to stay home and be with the kids, but it shouldn't necessarily be the woman. It should be whoever in the marriage would be better with the kids. And who knows like what will happen in the future. But that was just an example of showing the power of minority influence. Well, from research on minority influence, we now know that for the minority to influence the majority, the minority have to act these four different ways. First, they need to be really consistent. The story can't change. The story has to be the same over and over. They have to be persistent, so they don't shut up. It's the same story and it's repeated over and over and over. And they have to be confident. One of the best examples I have for minority influence is Dr. Kevorkian. When he came on the scene, I forget if it's called mercy killing or what the appropriate term is for it, but people who are in a lot of pain and they have a terminal illness, they have the right to say, "I want to die." So it's like assisted suicide. And Dr. Kevorkian thought assisted suicide is absolutely the morally correct thing to do. And he was very consistent. Anytime you heard him speak, he had the same message. He was very persistent. He was so persistent. He was on the cover of Time. He was on, there was a news show, Nightline, that was popular at the time at night. He was always on Nightline. He was in the newspaper all the time. They were always doing stories about him. So he was persistent. He was around all the time. He was consistent. His message was the same. Oh my goodness, was he confident. When I heard him talk, I'd be like, boy, he makes it sound like if you don't agree with him, you're an immoral, horrible human being. Like his way is the only way to think. Otherwise, you're ethically just reprehensible. And he was for lack of a better term, normal. It's hard to put this, like when you read the research articles, you can see the different ways that they did it. But it's like you can't, there isn't a reason that you can ignore the person. They don't have a way that allows you to say, I don't have to listen to them. Does that make sense? So Dr. Kevorkian was a medical doctor. I think he was at Columbia or Harvard, like a very prestigious university, years and years of publishing. He had had this amazing career. He had no mental health issues. He, he was normal in every way. So if you step back, you can go, no wonder he convinced people, because if he's consistent, so the story doesn't change. He's persistent, so he's all over the place and he never shuts up. He acts as though he's absolutely correct. And I can't dismiss him for some reason. I can't say, oh, well, he suffers from depression. I don't have to listen to him. He's got a mental health issue. I don't have to listen to him. Or think of all the reasons why we dismiss people. And I would argue we shouldn't be dismissing people. But sometimes if you have a mental health issue, you're dismissed. Sometimes people who are homophobic will dismiss people in the LGBTQ community. Some people will get dismissed because they're old or because they're young, or too young, too old. We dismiss people for a variety of reasons, but he was so normal, there was no way to dismiss him. So after a while, even if the topic of assisted suicide isn't that interesting to you, because everyone, like, it's all over the place and he's talking about it all the time, and he's so confident that if you don't agree with him, you're just a horrible human being. Over time, probably the topic is going to become important to you, and you're going to go, I do want to know more about this. And so you're going to listen to him, listen to his argument, and you're probably going to be using your central root of persuasion. Think of the elaboration likelihood model. You're not going to be using your peripheral root anymore, because he's made this topic, because he's so persistent and confident and you can't dismiss him. He's kind of made it personally relevant to you. He's made it of interest to you. And so you want to, so you start processing the information using that central root. So if you find his argument to be consistent, logical, and strong, you're actually going to change your mind and you're going to believe in assisted suicide. And when he started talking about it, it was like less than 5% of Americans were for assisted suicide. By the time he had been on the scene for like 5 years, and lots in the newspaper and TV and magazines all the time, radio all the time, the majority of Americans, I think it went up to 80% or 85%, ended up agreeing with him. Now, it doesn't mean just because you're consistent, persistent, confident, and normal that everyone will agree with you. So I can remember listening to his stuff, but then I looked at some other articles and they were saying that the majority of people that were doing assisted suicide were actually very low income, minorities, people who didn't have good health insurance, people that didn't want to burden their families. And I was like, I don't like this. I could see this being a way to, I didn't like it personally. But I'm just telling you, I'm giving you that as an example, not so that you agree with me in any way, shape, or form, but it doesn't mean that it will always work, okay? And if someone else, even though it's always on TV and the newspaper and blah, 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 may never have gotten to the point where they're like, okay, it's important for me to figure this out and really seek out information of it and use their central root. So minority influence, it's harder to get the influence to work than majority influence or conformity. But when it does work, paradoxically, it's more powerful than majority influence or conformity, because you not only get that public adherence, oh yes, the answer is one, they actually see it your way now. So unlike Ash's study, where when you were privately writing the answer down, you wrote down what you thought really was the right answer. With minority influence, you actually change their point of view and they actually agree with you in their heart of hearts. So it's like the military talks about changing their mind and hearts. Minority influence changes it all. So paradoxically, it's actually can be more powerful than majority influence, just another word for conformity. But conformity is much easier to get than minority influence. Okay. Now, sometimes it depends upon what book you're reading and this kind of thing. But sometimes with conformity, what we end up talking about is how do I want to phrase this? Sometimes when we talk about social influence, we'll put it into different categories, and we'll say one kind of influence is conformity, and this is when no one even asks you or tells you to do something, but you're influenced by them anyway. That's what we were just talking about, conformity, majority influence. Another kind of influence is compliance, where people ask you to do something and you do it, like an advertiser and such. I talked about the compliance research because it's where your textbook talked about it in the chapter that talked about persuasion, because really compliance could be persuasion. It's people are trying to change your attitude by asking you to do something or asking you to feel a certain way. And if they do, they've changed your attitude, they've persuaded you through compliance. Sometimes people will say another kind of influence is when someone with power, someone with authority tells or demands that you do something and you do it. And when that happens, we're going to call it obedience. Okay. Now, your textbook, does not split up influence that way. It just says there's all kinds of influence. So we can be influenced by our peers without them ever asking or telling us to do so. That's conformity or majority influence. And then there's influence by people who have authority over us or power over us, and that's obedience. Okay. And if you've had any course in psychology, even just an introduction to psychology course, you've learned about Milgram's classic study of obedience. I found a video that's a documentary that was published in 1962, very close to the time that Milgram was doing his work. Now it's an hour long, so I know I'm asking you for a big commitment, but that's why the rest of this video is going to be, my lecture video is shorter. I want you to watch that full 1 hour long, big long documentary looking at Milgram's classic study of obedience. In that documentary, not only will you be exposed to his classic study of obedience, but you'll get to see some of the variations that he did. And I think it's a great video. It was, like I said, published in 1962. So it's as close as we're going to get to what really was going on during that time. Another form of, we can call it obedience because it played a role in Zimbardo's prison study, but Zimbardo's prison study is a very classic study that looks at how social influence is affected based on the roles that we play. So if we're given the role of guard versus the role of prisoner, and we're in this mock prison, what happens? And so there's a link that I'd like you to watch, Zimbardo's prison study. Now, if you want to, there's a whole movie called The Stanford Prison Study. That's a Hollywood movie that they made that goes over the entire prison study, and it's pretty faithful. There's one part of it where one of the guards slaps the prisoner across the face, and that never happened. There was never any actual violence that occurred in the real study. But other than that, it's very accurate. And you might find it more entertaining to, sit down with some popcorn with a friend or your kids and watch the Stanford prison study movie. I think it's on Netflix, but I think it may cost money now to get it. It used to be like if you could stream Netflix, it was free, but I think now they charge you like $5 or something to watch it. You don't have to watch that whole big movie. You can just watch the link that I provided. So I want you to watch both of those so that you really understand Milgram's classic study on obedience and Zimbardo's Stanford University prison study. And again, I feel like I keep repeating myself, but if you have a Master's of Science in Behavioral Sciences on a general psychology track, everyone is going to assume that you know about Milgram's study. I mean, that is talked about in an intro to psychology class that freshmen take as an undergrad. And Zimbardo's prison study is talked about in every undergraduate social psychology class. So it's very important to me that you know about Ash's classic study, Sheriff's classic study, Milgram's classic study, and Zimbardo's prison study. It's important that you know about all of these studies. So, okay, the last part of this is the last slide. The last part of the chapter talks about leadership. Excuse me. And we begin just by defining leadership. Leadership is just when one or a few of the members of a group are able to influence the other members of the group. That's all leadership is. When one or more people are able to influence the rest of the group, then that means that the people who influence the rest of the group are the group leaders. So the big question that everyone always asks are leaders born or made? So my daughter, when she was young, you could say even now, when she was in certain situations, people would say to me all the time, "Oh my goodness, she's a born leader." I can remember taking her into first grade. I'm like, this was big time now, first grade. You're not in kindergarten anymore. And I remember us walking in, I was holding her hand, and like she looked up at me and she was kind of scared. And I'm looking down at her, like, I'm kind of scared for you too. This is first grade. This is, big deal. And we walk into the room and she looks, and one of the kids in the room said, "Patricia's here." And my daughter runs into the room then and says, "Let's play follow the leader. I'm the leader." And in no time at all these kids were following her around, and, she was having a ball. And I could see her in many different situations as she was playing sports, when she was on a gymnastics team, a science team, all these different things. She oftentimes would end up playing a leadership role. My husband also is a leader. So our leader's born. So she has that genetic thing to be a leader. My husband's a leader. My mom's a leader. My daughter's a leader. Or are leaders made? So is it that anyone can be a leader if they can develop certain skills of persuasion, skills of social influence, and anyone can be a leader? And you might think, oh, who cares? That's just some thing that people in an ivory tower sit and try to decipher or talk about. Who gives a flying flip? But actually, this is a really important thing to know, because it lets a company know or organization know where they want to put their money. If leaders are born, then we want to select leaders very carefully. So if I need someone to take over a department, I'm trying to hire a manager, a leader, and I know that leaders are born, then I'm going to spend a whole bunch of time interviewing candidates and coming up with really good screening tests to figure out who's a good leader. And after they're hired, I'm not going to give them any training. They're a born leader. They'll do great. If, on the other hand, leaders are made, then I can hire anyone. I can hire the person who will accept the least amount of money. And then I'm going to put all my time and money into training that person, and to training them. They'll do workshop after workshop after workshop till they become a good leader. So it's not just this, esoteric intellectual idea that we're talking about. It really makes a difference in the real world. Okay. So which is it? Are leaders born or are they made? Well, it's kind of interesting. The research isn't, well, here's one big study that was done. They tried to look at all leaders in all different, not all leaders, but looked at leaders from all different areas. So they looked at spiritual leaders, leaders who were like in sports, leaders in government, military leaders. So they're looking at leaders in a variety of different social leaders, music leaders. So they're looking at leaders in a variety of different areas. And they also looked at over time. So they included Mussolini and Gandhi as long as leaders who are more contemporary. And what they tried to do is figure out how the leaders differed from their followers. And in this huge big study where they're looking at all this, they found basically not much difference. They found leaders tended to be more charismatic, so they were better liked than followers. But what was interesting is what made them better liked was really different if they were a military leader versus a spiritual leader versus a sports leader versus, so it wasn't like if you have these particular characteristics, you'll be well liked and you'll be a leader. It's just that if you are well liked, you're more likely to be a leader. But what made you better liked varied greatly depending upon the situation. So that didn't really pan out to be much. The only statistically significant findings that they did find is that leaders are slightly taller than their followers and slightly more intelligent than their followers. But that doesn't, like, if you're the president of a university, you got a lot of smart people there. So you might be slightly more intelligent, but everyone in there is pretty intelligent or at least hardworking. So it's not like intelligence is going to be a predictor of leadership. It isn't. So basically from doing that, the researchers kind of went, we need to look at leader. Are they born or are they made? We're not sure, but they're probably made because it's not even sure what characteristics make a leader a leader. They're not consistent across all different areas. And so a whole bunch of theories came out, which we call contingency theories of leadership. And Fiedler, the one that's talked about in your textbook, so it's the one I'm going to talk about, is Fiedler's contingency theory of leadership. And Fiedler's, all of the contingency theories of leadership all have this in common. They don't say good leaders look like this. What they say instead is that there has to be a good match between characteristics of the situation and characteristics of the leader. And when these match well, that leader will be a good leader in that situation. But that leader would be a terrible leader in a different situation. But for this situation, this is what a good leader looks like. That's that's all of the contingency theories of leadership. Now, Fiedler's contingency theory of leadership, the situation that he's looking at has to do basically with how the structure of the tasks that the group is going to be asked to perform, how much legitimate authority does the leader have, and how well the people in the group and the leader all get along with one another. And when all of these are high, he's going to say that this is a high situation control situation. So one of the highest situation control situations that I can think of is the military. So in the military, there's lots of task structure. In fact, if you have this job, there's a manual you can look at and you're supposed to be doing exactly these tasks. So there's high task structure. The leader, if you're the officer of that group, you have lots of position power. The followers are supposed to do exactly what you tell them to do, when they tell you to do it, how you tell them to do it. So there's lots of position power, there's lots of task structure, and the military does a lot of things to try to get the group members to all have a good relationship among one another. They do group building tasks to get them to be cohesive and enjoy one another, this kind of thing. So all three of these are high. The military is a good example of high situation control. You can also think of a situation where there's low situation control. Perhaps, don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to do this, but let's say in this class, I want you to work on a group project. So I assign you guys randomly to work in groups of 3, or let's say 4 or 5 even. I'm going to have you work in groups of 5. There's no actual leader in the group, but a leader will emerge. There'll be someone in the group who will influence the group more than everyone else, but that person has no position power at all. And if the task that I give you to do in a group is, I want you to design an experiment to test a topic that's of interest to you, well, talk about no task structure or hardly any. I mean, yes, you have to design an experiment, but it can be about any talk, about anything you want, using any of the experimental methods. You could use repeated measures. You could use between subjects design. You can have as many independent variables as you want, as many dependent variables as you want, any topic you want. So very low task structure. And I just threw strangers together. I put 5 of you randomly in a group. So it's not like the leader-member relationships are going to be especially good. So that's a situation where there's low situation control. And then you could see how this is on a continuum. So sometimes it's going to be in the middle. In fact, more often than not, it's the middle. I was chair of the psychology department here for over a decade. And during those 10 years, I felt like as chair, I had medium situation control. There, being chair, there was some position power, like I was asked to evaluate the people, but if I wanted to fire someone, I didn't have power to do that. But I could have power to do a plan of development. We need to get you, doing better than what you are doing. As far as task structure, there was some structure. You need to show up to class on time. You need to be talking about the content. The students need to be able to understand you. You need to be organized enough where they can follow what you're doing. But there are a million right ways to be a great teacher. Some use PowerPoints. Dr. Alexander, who everyone loved for decades, he told wonderful stories without a PowerPoint slide in sight. And he was a great teacher. So there's a million different ways to do it. And then leader-member relations, the faculty got along. I mean, yeah, we all liked one another, but it's not like we did all went to some, task building thing. We didn't, eat out together if we didn't want to. Our social life wasn't dependent on one another at all. So there, yes, we got along, but we weren't like best friends or like in the military where they do tons of things together all the time. Okay, so that is medium situation control. So now I've talked about the situation. When Fiedler talks about leaders, he talks about being a low or high LPC leader. Now, here at Cameron, we have a program that gets people to become LPCs, licensed professional counselors. That's not what Fiedler's talking about. LPC means your least preferred coworker. So the way that he defined this is he would ask you to think about your least preferred coworker. Of all the people you've ever worked with, who's the one that you prefer the least? Your least preferred coworker. Get that person in your head. What does that person look like? How do they act? What do they do? Okay. Then he asks you, I want you to describe this person. And he looks to see how positively or negatively you describe that person. If you describe the person positively, he's going to call you a high LPC leader. And high LPC leaders are very interested in making sure that everyone in the group gets along really well. If you describe that person as, oh my gosh, they're awful, Satan incarnate, they were terrible, terrible human being, you're a low LPC leader. Low LPC leaders tend to be really interested in accomplishing tasks, and they don't care about making sure everyone gets along with one another. Okay. I am a low LPC leader. Okay. The people that I worked with, like my least preferred coworkers, they stood in my way of getting the stuff done that needed to get done, and I couldn't get out of my way. You're supposed to be helping us. If you're in the way, you're causing me a lot of grief. And so I'm a low LPC leader. My mother, she ran a healthcare company for decades. She is a high LPC leader. How do I know? I could tell whichever her least preferred coworker was, that was the person who would be invited to our family dinners at night. My mom didn't start working until I was 13, but by my junior and senior year of high school, when we would have family and we'd have our family dinners, about once a week, she'd invite someone from her office to eat with us. And so often the people were the most prickly people that are difficult to get along with. And over time, I realized she's inviting the people to eat with us who she doesn't like, her least preferred coworkers, because she has this idea that everyone is super likable if you get to know them well enough. So working with them was really hard, and she didn't like them very much. And so she was like, I need to purpose myself to get to know them better. And if I get to know them better, then I will like them. So I got stuck having dinner with them. So, but you get an idea of what a low versus high LPC leader is. What Fiedler's contingency theory of leadership, what his research demonstrated, was that your high LPC leader does best in medium situation control. So my mom would have probably be one of the best chairs of a psychology department there is, or chair at a university. She was really great in her healthcare company. Again, very much medium situation control. But low LPC leaders tend to be really good when there's high situation control, like military leaders, and low situation control, like the one that emerges in a group team. Okay. So again, there isn't like this is a great leader, this is a bad leader. These are different kinds of leaders, and they need to mesh well with the situation that they're in. That's contingency theory of leadership. And we talked about Fiedler's. So toward the end of your chapter, there's a whole section on gender differences in leadership and influence and persuasion. And I'm just going to let you read this in the textbook, because I think this video is already longer than I wanted it to be. Given that this week, I really want you to spend a whole hour watching Milgram's video about the documentary about Milgram's study. I want you to watch the 5-minute video on Ash's study, and then the video about Zimbardo's study. So, all right, I hope you enjoyed this social influence material. I think after this percolates, you're going to start noticing the groups that you're in. You are going to notice so much, some normative influence, some informational influence. You're going to notice who's emerging as the leader. Do they seem to be? It's really interesting. Knowing this stuff really changes how you understand human behavior, I think, in a really positive way. I think it's one of the more important chapters that we have. Okay, I will see you next week.